Hello, and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. Today, I'm at magnificent Windsor Castle, the oldest and largest occupied castle in the world. Windsor Castle has been home to 40 monarchs since it was founded by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. It's situated in a quiet locale, about 25 miles from central London. So visiting here has been a rare and special invitation for an American president. In fact, only 5 sitting presidents have been welcomed to Windsor Castle as either part of a state visit or for an afternoon tea. You might recall a very famous photo of President Ronald Reagan riding horses with Queen Elizabeth at Windsor Great Park. President Reagan was the first sitting president to stay overnight at Windsor when he visited in 1982. Since then, Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump have all been to Windsor to meet with the late Queen, or King Charles III. Those meetings speak to the truly special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. Well, I'm here today to talk about that special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, but also between the White House Historical Association and the Royal Collection Trust. We're both stewards of remarkable museum-quality art collections. And here in 2026, we're partnering to commemorate America's semi-quincentennial by looking at the works of several American-born artists who were favored by King George III in the late 18th century, around the time of the Declaration of Independence and its signing. It was founding father Benjamin Franklin who once lamented that our geniuses all go to Europe, referring to the painters Benjamin West, John Singleton Copley, and John Taylor. These painters were all born in the colonies and later moved to England to pursue their careers. So we're going to learn more about them today and their works with our very special guest, Tim Knox, Director of the Royal Collection. Tim, thank you so much for being with us today, and it's a true honor and a privilege for me to be here at Windsor to talk with you about the Royal Collection.
Thanks, Stuart. Really lovely to see you.
So, Tim, we're here at Windsor Castle in a very special room. Tell us about this place where we are.
So we're in the White Drawing Room as part of the semi-state apartments at Windsor Castle. And these very richly decorated rooms, filled with the most superlative French furniture and decorative arts, were arranged here, were built here for King George IV. And this is the White Drawing Room. There's a green one and there's a crimson one. Best known probably as where Queen Elizabeth II had her tea with Paddington Bear.
That was quite the summit for the Platinum Jubilee, I believe.
That's correct, yeah. And of course, as you remember, Her Majesty delved into her handbag and produced a marmalade sandwich.
That's right, quite an iconic moment. That's really special. Well, as we're surrounded by these works, just a sampling of the works that are in the Royal Collection, describe that collection for me, the size and how it came to be.
So the Royal Collection really is the last 350 years of collecting by British monarchs and indeed their consorts. And it's a collection said to number in excess of 1 million objects. It's not just pictures, it's not just furniture, it's works of art of every description and ranging from the crown jewels, for instance, through porcelain, suits of armour, books, manuscripts, and so on.
So tell me, Tim, the difference between the Royal Collection and its history and the Royal Collection Trust. How did each of those come about?
So the Royal Collection is the collection formed by successive British monarchs. It goes back to about the 17th century. Obviously, the great collection of Charles I was sold, but a lot was recaptured. And indeed, since then, monarchs have added to the Royal Collection in various ways, some of them being very avid collectors, others not. And so that's the Royal Collection. The Royal Collection Trust was founded in the early 1980s as a department of the royal household to look after this great responsibility and also to manage the opening of the royal palaces. And then we were made a charitable trust in 1993 so that we could use the profits from opening the palaces and indeed selling merchandise in our shops to devote that to the care of the collection and improvement of visitor facilities. And so that's why the Royal Collection Trust exists today.
So prior to the establishment of the trust, Who would have cared for the art and objects, and how would that have been funded?
So in the old days, they were considered part of the Lord Chamberlain's responsibilities. And I think the Royal Collection was very much treated as, very much like sort of ordinary tables and chairs and things like that. It was just the furnishings of the palace. And indeed, in the very old days, of course, whenever a monarch died, the great officers of state had a right to the whatever furnishings were in his apartment. And so that's why if you go to places like Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, or Hardwick Hall, or Grimsthorpe Castle, or indeed Hatfield House, you'll find all the state beds and thrones and chairs of state that were owned by some of the early Stuart monarchs, because the great officers of state took them home. I'm pleased to say that was put a stop to in the 18th century, and so we now these things remain here.
Well, we have a similar tale in that there was no White House collection until the Kennedy presidency, when it was established by Mrs. Kennedy, who also founded our organization. So prior to that, a new president could come into the White House and things would be out of style or fashion or worn or frayed, and they wanted something new or contemporary, and they would auction it or sell it or give it away, or a previous president would take it with them and they would add something new and contemporary. At the time, they didn't have the appreciation for what we would call antiques or Americana today, and Mrs. Kennedy took it back to that standard. And in fact, the White House today is an accredited museum, and thanks in large measure to her initiatives, and that were carried on by our work. So we have
I think a very similar professionalization, shall we say, of our establishments.
That's right.
Yeah.
So did Queen Elizabeth II and now King Charles III, have they added to the collection themselves?
During her long reign, as you can imagine, Queen Elizabeth II was given wonderful gifts from all over the world, but she also had as you can imagine, a keen eye for a portrait of a horse or a dog. So there are many of those in the Royal Collection. King Charles III is not only is he a huge enthusiast for the arts, but he's also an accomplished watercolorist in his own right. He is someone who, in his spare time, he very much values the practice of watercolor. And I'm pleased to say that his watercolors, although they're still his own private property, are things that we look after. And he's a very generous lender to exhibitions. And he has made a particular speciality of collecting works by artists who he himself knows. And in many cases, they accompany him on his overseas tours. So that's a lovely aspect of the Royal Collection.
Tell us about you. How long have you been in this role, and what does your role encompass?
So I've been director of the Royal Collection since for almost 8 years, and I moved here from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And my job really is to look after the Royal Collection department of the Royal Household, which is also a charitable trust dedicated to looking after the Royal Collection and also sharing it with the public. And that's really what we do. We have just under 700 members of staff, ranging from curators to conservators, but also, as you might imagine, all the different specialisms that a large museum might need, as well as our magnificent wardens and visitor services staff who, of course, help explain our sites to the public.
Having a career of interest in art, do you recall your first time at Buckingham Palace or at Windsor Castle and seeing the art in this collection and your thoughts and impressions of it at that time?
Well, I happen to know that I came aged 12 years old to Windsor Castle on a school trip, and that was my first visit. And because I wasn't brought up in England, I was brought up in Africa and the Pacific. It was, as you imagine, a bit of a shock to the system seeing such a lavishly decorated place as Windsor Castle. But I remember being absolutely enchanted. But oddly enough, also, Windsor Castle is home to Queen Mary's Doll's House, which is a very serious, very beautiful, very large and beautifully appointed doll's house that was created for Queen Mary, the consort of George V. And I remember being particularly impressed with that as a child. But of course, since then, Windsor and indeed the other palaces have continued to fascinate.
And as we go through the halls and the corridors and the rooms of Windsor Castle, all of the art we see is part of the collection, or is there anything that is on loan to Windsor from other collections?
No, everything is Royal Collection.
Wow. And how does someone say I wanted to have something loaned to my home from the Royal Collection? How does one go about that?
So we do lend objects to museums and institutions. I'm not sure about your home, Stuart, but we are, the King, His Majesty is a very generous lender. There are over 10,000 objects on permanent loan all over the world.
10,000 on loan.
10,000 objects, yeah.
That's remarkable.
And that they range from the Raphael cartoons at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to a very large picture of the opening of the Parliament in Australia in Canberra, which is in the Parliament House in Canberra. The only thing we ask is, of course, that they're very carefully looked after, and we obviously take the care and condition of the Royal Collection incredibly seriously. So obviously we don't send things abroad that are very fragile and so on. But I'm pleased to say that it enables people all over the world to enjoy things from the Royal Collection.
With such a large collection, there's always a tremendous amount of conservation work, I'm sure, that has to be done. How does that take place, and how is that funded? How do you take care of this large collection?
So the Royal Collection, as well as opening the palaces, also runs the shops, and obviously ticket sales and sales from the shop, are the income of the Royal Collection. And we are a charity, so all our profits get ploughed back into the care and maintenance of the collection, and indeed improving facilities for the visitors. And so luckily over the last 30 or 40 years, we've been able to do a lot conserving the collection and improving its presentation to the public. And currently we have about 30 curators and a similar number of conservators, and we look after we can do most types of conservation. The only things we don't do in-house are very, very large paintings, which we don't have the accommodation for. Tapestries, where we work very closely with the tapestry workshops at Hampton Court, which are run by our sister organisation, Historic Royal Palaces. And then finally, we don't do very large pieces of sculpture, but otherwise textiles, suits of armour, paintings, sculpture, furniture, gilding, we can all do that in-house.
I was struck by the story of the restoration of a very large malachite vase that had some severe damage done to it, and now it looks beautiful.
Yes, so this is the huge malachite vase, which was presented by the Emperor of Russia. And it's a stupendous piece. It sits in the grand reception room of Windsor Castle. In 1992, a terrible fire damaged that part of the castle. And in fact, the vase was not so much affected by flames as by smoke and by the water from the firemen's hoses. And having had been filled with water, the malachite, which was of course a veneer applied in very small pieces all around the exterior of this vase, all dropped off and molted off. It was all had to be picked up and very carefully stuck back together again. But if you see the vase today, which still presides over the grand reception room, I'm pleased to say you would never know that it had gone through
spectacular. I have
this
seen
rather
it. It is quite
terrifying experience. Yeah.
And I have been on the public tours of Buckingham Palace and Windsor, and would encourage all followers of this podcast and Americans to visit and to see these very special places, just like I encourage the visit to the White House. I think the importance of place in our history is so meaningful to understand these venues of leadership where the monarchs and our presidents lead and where they visit one another.
Yes, I think the important thing is that here you see the furniture and paintings and other works of art in their natural habitat. They are being used in a royal palace. Many of them were created for exactly the same situations and a utility that they are still, purpose that they're still serving today. And the fact that Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle are still very much used as places to entertain and impress visiting heads of state, rather like the White House, I think is a really important part of our work. We take great pride in the fact that the collection is still used. So for a state banquet, George IV's magnificent gold service is still decks the tables. And I think that's a very vital part of our work, is to ensure that we support the royal programme in whatever way we can.
Do you still make acquisitions for the collection?
Yes, we're not great acquirers, I would say, but of course we look after the various official gifts that are given to the sovereign. But we also, from time to time, spot things in sales that we think are important, not so much to fill gaps, but to if they are significant to the history of the royal collection or to particular monarchs. But the only criterion is, does the king want us to acquire it? And so once we get royal permission, we will go out and see if we can secure it. So in recent years, we've acquired a number of things, but yes.
And as with the White House collection, although the White House collection is much smaller in terms of quantity, I believe that these collections tell a story about our countries and about those who have led our various countries and acquired these things over the years. And it was 2 or 3 years ago that you and I began a conversation looking at American artists in the Royal Collection and, of course, British-born artists in the White House collection. And there's quite a story there. And I think as part of the American Semi-Quincentennial, while we're having this conversation today, it's a way to have an interest in each other's collection and to tell that story a little bit. Tell us about some of the American, and I was quite intrigued to learn from you about King George III's interest in American artists. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, the Royal Collection really traces the changing tastes of British monarchs, and not only their taste, but also their financial wherewithal, whether they were able to afford objects and so on. And George III proved to be a great admirer of American artists. And in fact, there are several artists who worked here in Britain who were American-born, who were extensively patronized by King George III. Perhaps the most well-known is Benjamin West, who became the King's historical painter. He was appointed the president of the Royal Academy, which of course had the patronage of the King. And he eventually became the surveyor of the King's pictures. So he was a very important personage indeed.
And did the American War of Independence have any impact on his favor with these artists?
So Benjamin West, who was born in Springfield in Pennsylvania, came to Britain as a comparatively young man in his 20s to seek his fortune, because obviously the opportunity for commissions in Pennsylvania was very limited. And he became an almost instant success. He was very much encouraged by Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was one of the great leading artists of the day and was introduced, in fact, to King George III through Reynolds and also another patron who was the Archbishop of York. He rapidly sort of ascends the rungs of the social establishment and producing a number of quite important, rather than portraits, he seems to have excelled in history paintings. So paintings depicting a particular historical event. And this very much touches a chord. And King George III, as I said, ends up becoming one of his most important patrons. And he ended up commissioning over 60 pictures, George III, from West. But West was very discreet. He never expressed, apparently, any opinion on the American wars or indeed on independence. So we do not know what his views were.
That's good. Well, if it were today, you'd get a breaking news update every 15 minutes about something that the King George probably thought about, things going on with America. But it was a different time. And it would be interesting to have that type of conversation with them today, in today's context, as to what they think of these works and how they really represent our country, your country and our country. I have a little theory on American portraits of our presidents and first ladies that are in the White House. At the time the portraits were done of our early presidents and first ladies, that's how Americans knew what they looked like. They didn't have the images, the digital images and the cameras that we have today. And so the portraits depicted for the country to see what their president and their first lady looked like. Now that we're saturated with the images of our presidents and first ladies, and we have the privilege of working with our former presidents and first ladies on their portraits and selecting the artists and having them done, I think they're done now to depict more how these recent presidents and first ladies see themselves and how they want to be remembered and depicted. What is your view about, as we look at the portraits and the paintings of the royals themselves, that particularly from King George and his family, how do you have a sense of how he may have wanted himself depicted or how he may have directed those artists to paint those
So
portraits?
King George and Queen Charlotte were keen patrons of the arts. Actually, George's great passion was books, and then scientific instruments and things like clocks and watches were the second. But they very carefully thought about their public image, and indeed also for, normal personal reasons, they also commissioned portraits of their family and indeed their friends. So we're lucky enough to have a wonderful array of portraits by Benjamin West of George III, his wife Queen Charlotte, and of their children. And indeed many of them were engraved and were the subject of prints, which of course, as you mentioned, were a key way of disseminating the likeness of the royal family to the wider world. But of course, as we'll encounter later on, there are numerous portraits of George III in different guises, and it's very interesting how they chose to present themselves.
Our country, of course, is much younger than yours, and we wouldn't be the United States if it were not for the United Kingdom. We see the works at the White House collection as a continuity of history, this continuum from presidency to presidency to presidency. Do you see that in the collection when you look at the works as you go down these halls and in these rooms? Do you see the different eras that they represent?
Absolutely. And of course, although I mentioned the Royal Collection really being some 350 years of collecting, the monarchy goes back much further than that. Obviously, there was a great sale of King Charles I's collections during the Commonwealth. And obviously that provided a kind of break, but we have, objects of which go right back to the very earliest monarchs in the collection. I think the earliest object in the Royal Collection is a 12th century anointing spoon in the regalia at the Tower of London, part of the crown jewels that dates from the 12th century. So that is a very, ancient object. But of course, if you walk around the staterooms at Windsor Castle, there are portraits of monarchs going right back to the earliest times. It's basically British history kind of brought to life.
Mm-hmm. We have a painting here that I think that we should talk about that is in the vein of one of George III's.
So this is
favorites.
Benjamin West's portrait of Prince Octavius, who was one of the youngest sons of George III and Queen Charlotte. It's by Benjamin West. It's an absolutely charming portrait. The little prince is shown with his father's sword and his other military accoutrements, playing with these oversized weapons.
He looks to be maybe 3 or 4 years old, really young.
Yes, he dies very sadly shortly after this painting is painted, of the smallpox, which of course was a great scourge among little people at that time. In the background, you can just see a distant view out to Horse Guards, and it was obviously evoking a potential future career for the young prince, which sadly he never lived to achieve. But I think it shows Benjamin West at his best as a portraitist, particularly of young children. I think it shows a sensitivity and a charm that is particularly impressive. And we've got another portrait of Prince Octavius, a rather melancholy one, because of course after his death, his parents were absolutely devastated, and they commissioned for Britain, a rather strange allegorical portrait showing young Prince Octavius, who had just died, being introduced by a solicitous angel to his even younger brother, who had also died in infancy, Prince Alfred. And they're shown almost like a sort of Italian Renaissance religious painting, sort of floating in clouds. And these two little cherubs are kind of, meeting each other up in heaven. And apparently the king and queen viewed this painting by Benjamin West again and were deeply affected by it. And indeed, it is said that George III never really got over the death of these two little boys. Yeah, so he was a great family man, George III. I know that some of the American propaganda has shown him as a sort of a monstrous figure, but actually he was very human, rather avuncular, like nothing more than reviewing his agricultural experiments here in the park at Windsor. They had this very large family, 13 odd children, and they used to enjoy parading on the North Terrace and meeting members of the public.
Now, would they have done portraits or had portraits done of all of those children?
I think nearly all the children were painted by one or the other of the artists, not all by Benjamin West, but we have a number of examples in the collection. We also have wonderful portraits of George III and Queen Charlotte by Benjamin West. There's also a portrait of Queen Charlotte wearing a very beautiful dress, and in the background is a great crowd of their children shown in the gardens outside the Queen's house, which was a large, rather barrack-like edifice here just below Windsor Castle, where before they had fully restored the castle, George III and Queen Charlotte actually lived when they came to Windsor.
What do you speculate that George III would think that here we are in 2026, someone from the American president's house would be here under this roof, speaking to someone taking care of what is his royal collection, and the camaraderie and the friendship and the special relationship that our nations enjoy today? Do you think he would have seen that at all possible?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think George III had a very soft spot for the Americans. And I think that was one of the great sort of sadnesses, was that the colonies were lost in his reign. And indeed, we know that with the resumption of diplomatic ties, he treated the envoy as with great respect and cordiality. So I think George III would be very pleased and proud that we're friends again.
Yes, I'm not sure what George Washington would think, but I'm glad to know that George III would think so.
So Benjamin West, many of the pictures that he executed for his royal patron were history paintings, and they were sometimes of quite recent history. And one such canvas is called The Death of the Chevalier Bayard, and it's set in late medieval France. And it shows the French hero in his armour, sort of expiring under a tree. He's been offered to be evacuated and removed from danger, and he says, "I'll stay here, thank you very much." And this was part of a great sequence of historical pictures that George III commissioned from Benjamin West, that, to tell you the truth, they're not much prized today. They're not really in today's taste, but we have a large number of them in the Royal Collection here. And it just shows you actually how tastes change over the centuries. Probably more of interest to today's audiences is a very famous painting called The Death of Wolfe. And this was the great English military hero, General James Wolfe, who died at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec in 1759. And this was a great turning point of the expulsion of the French from Canada. Benjamin West painted a very stirring scene of the death of General Wolfe, almost like a Italian Pietà or a religious painting, showing the hero, slain hero, sort of expiring in the arms of his brother officers, with the battle sort of going on around him. Actually, it bears absolutely no resemblance to historical fact, but it was a huge success when it was exhibited, and George III was a great admirer and visited at the Royal Academy. Unfortunately, he hesitated and didn't buy it, and it was snapped up by one of his subjects, the Sir Richard Grosvenor, and it's now, the original painting is now in the National Gallery of Canada. But George III obviously felt he'd missed a trick, and so he commissioned an exact copy. And this is what we have in the Royal Collection today.
We've principally talked about portraits or images of people or heroes. Did they commission works that were landscapes or of architecture, other things, or was it principally their interest?
I think in the case of Benjamin West, there are some very beautiful landscapes by Benjamin West, but they weren't things that George III commissioned. I suspect George had a rather sort of literal frame of mind and liked portraits and things of, representations of historical events. But of course, when we get on to our other artist, John Taylor, he specializes in landscapes, and we have a few examples of those.
And were his works commissioned by monarchs, or were they acquired by the collection?
So John Taylor is a very little known artist, even in America. He's born in Philadelphia. He comes from a wealthy mercantile family, and he comes to England as a young man with the rest of his family. They're loyalists, and they leave because of all the tumult in revolutionary America. They return to England and settle in Bath, and they're very comfortably off. And John Taylor, we don't know anything really about his early training, but he develops a landscape style that's very much indebted to a French 17th century painter called Claude Lorraine, who in a way conjured up the Arcadian vision of countryside that was so admired by British patrons in the 18th century. And indeed, many of our great landscape gardens are based on paintings by Claude Lorraine, who lived and actually worked mainly in Italy. And John Taylor Taylor, who we think probably spent time in Europe, developed a very convincing, shall we say, Claudian style himself. He's entirely painted landscapes, or occasionally there were ruins introduced and cattle and sheep and things like that. But generally speaking, they are very beautiful landscapes. And George III, we know, acquired a number for himself. So we have 5 paintings today by John Taylor. And I'm pleased to say that with a growing interest in early American artists, interest in John Taylor has increased. And indeed, rediscoveries are being made quite regularly of his paintings, often in obscure British collections where he's not generally recognised. Rather annoyingly, he's known as John Taylor of Bath. He should be John Taylor of Philadelphia, I think.
Yes. And yet another artist, the American-born artist favored by George III,
is John Singleton Copley, and he's a Bostonian. And we don't know very much about his artistic training. And this is a very interesting thing, is that with Benjamin West, he's a self-taught genius. We know very little about how he develops his skills. Copley is a rather similar artist, and indeed John Taylor we know very little as well. The thing about Copley is that he develops this very, very elegant and accomplished portraiture, style of portraiture. And he's in his 30s when he finally emigrates over to Britain. So he has quite a successful run in Boston, which of course is a very cosmopolitan and elegant city, even in the 18th century. And the early portraits of the sober citizens of Boston are some of the great treasures of American museums. And he sends a portrait to an exhibition in London of a young man with a flying squirrel, apparently, and it's an absolute success. And this eventually encourages him to move to Britain and set himself up as an artist, where he, of course, takes commissions for portraits. And eventually he gets introduced to the royal family and is commissioned to produce a portrait of the 3 youngest daughters of King George III and Queen Charlotte. And they are Princess Mary, Princess Amelia, who's shown in a little sort of baby carriage, and then being pushed by Princess Sophia. And they are absolute charmers, these little girls, all dressed in feathers and big bonnets and lots of satin and muslin, very splendid. And it's a picture that it usually hangs in the Green Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace, and is a great favourite with our visitors. When it was first exhibited, it was criticised for being almost too unruly and not sufficiently dignified for princesses, because there are dogs and parrots hanging from branches and things. Parrots, actually, oddly enough, a very rare parrot that is only to be found in an island in Indonesia, can be identified from this picture. But it's a wonderful picture of these 3 little girls.
This is a very unfair question, but what are your favorite elements of the collection?
People always ask me that, Stuart. And to be honest, I vary almost monthly what it is, whatever's the latest discovery or the latest revelation. I suppose the current one is a wonderful portrait of a greyhound that belonged to Prince Albert, that usually hangs in Balmoral by the Victorian artist Landseer. It's a wonderful glossy thing. And so that's my current favourite. But I do change from time to time.
One of the things I love about my job is I get to learn something new every day. I can work here the rest of my life and not know all there is to know about the White House and its history. Is there something that you have discovered recently or learned recently that was interesting or fascinating or a surprise to you about something in the collection?
Yes, we're always making discoveries, actually. And over the years, every year we have a wonderful course called Royal Collection Studies. And what we love is the way that curators from all over the world come here. And quite often it's their insights that gives us insights into what we have, things that perhaps we haven't taken seriously enough or recognised. And so there have been some wonderful discoveries along that way. But I think almost, annually at least, we find something that has been, rediscovered. But it's a wonderful sense of adventure in the collection, isn't it?
So I've enjoyed this conversation in this magical space, but I understand you want to show us.
Yes, in St. George's Hall, we have a painting by Gainsborough Dupont. Let's go and see it.
Let's go take a look. So here we are in the Grand St. George's Hall. Tell us about this space.
So St George's Hall is a late medieval kind of banqueting hall that is the sort of historic place where the knights of the Order of the Garter met to feast. And it was refurbished in the early 19th century for King George IV. And this amazing sort of Gothic decoration. But in 1992, a terrible fire broke out just behind us in what was the chapel of the castle and destroyed the hall. And indeed, this was left a roofless, blackened shell. Luckily, most of the works of art in the castle had been removed because there was a major rewiring program going on. But the restoration, which took place between 1993 and was completed in 1997, saw the recreation of St George's Hall. And the rather nice thing is that before the original Wyatville, it was designed by Sir Geoffrey Wyatville, who was an architect for George IV, the ceiling was just a plaster fictive vault. And when they came to rebuild it, they decided to make it a proper oak hammer beam roof. So in a sense, it's a more splendid space than it ever was before.
Well, it's spectacular. And of course, most recently, for Americans, the site of the state dinner hosted by the King and Queen for President and Mrs. Trump.
That's right. So normally state visits take place in London at Buckingham Palace. We've got another major building project there, which meant that most of that programme is now transferred here to Windsor Castle, which I think makes for a far more historic and splendid setting.
Such a spectacular space to have that one long table down this whole space.
Absolutely. And as I said earlier, the table is decked with the extraordinary gold service commissioned by George IV, which is over 2,000 pieces of silver gilt, of very elaborate silverware and gold gilded silverware, which again makes for a real, with all the flowers and candles and things, it makes for an absolutely spectacular setting.
Well, we're here in this space to talk about this magnificent portrait by Gainsborough DuPont.
Yes, so I wanted to introduce you to this. This is a portrait of George III in robes of state by Gainsborough DuPont. And you may think, now Gainsborough, I recognise that name, and indeed he is the nephew of the famous British artist Thomas Gainsborough. He's the son of Thomas Gainsborough's sister Sarah and her husband Philip DuPont. And like Gainsborough, he's born in Sudbury in Suffolk, but he is brought into his uncle's workshop and is his chief assistant. And Gainsborough is a bit of an artistic loner. He doesn't have a big studio of workshop assistants like Reynolds does. He just paints all his pictures himself. And Gainsborough DuPont, the nephew, is the only one allowed to help him. And indeed, after Gainsborough's death, DuPont continues to produce portraits and other works in the studio. And this portrait is actually a version of a portrait of George III painted by his uncle, Thomas Gainsborough, wearing the Windsor uniform, which is a uniform that King George III designed to wear here in Windsor. It's a dark blue coat with a red collar and cuffs. But here he is in much grander robes, the ermine trimmed robes that he'd wear for a state occasion. And it was exhibited at the Royal Academy. Apparently, George III said that of all the portraits painted of him, this was the best likeness, because it shows him as a rather sort of slender, elegant, dapper creature. No wonder he liked it so much.
That's right.
The critics weren't so forgiving. They said that the glare of the crimson drapery was offensive.
Oh, no. Well, it has a place of prominence here in this grand hall.
And of course, in the White House, you have a very beautiful portrait by Gainsborough DuPont of Mrs. Brinsley Sheridan.
Yes, of course.
The wife of the playwright, the rather unfortunate wife of the philandering playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and a very lovely portrait by Gainsborough DuPont.
One of the artists that we share in common in our mutual collections, and throughout the course of this semi-quincentennial year, we'll be having a program of social media on your channels and on our channels, sharing some of these stories, sharing more of these works, and introducing each other's viewers, followers, to the collection of these two great, magnificent, storied homes or in your case, multiple homes, in our case, one home. But I think it's going to be a wonderful partnership that we have, and I'm so grateful for your participation with us on this.
Really looking forward to it, Stuart.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been spectacular to have you talk with us today and unpack these stories about the Royal Collection and the Royal Collection Trust and how you care for these magnificent works of art that represent 3.5 centuries of collecting here in the Royal Collection. And it's just a very special privilege to be here.
It's
Very
a pleasure,
honored.
Stuart.
Thank
How
you
nice.
so
Thank you.
much. Thank you. Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode, and watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book, or even the official White House Christmas ornament, you're helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, our White House History Live, in-person and virtual events, and our latest initiative, the People's House, a White House experience. You know, we're bringing the White House and its storied history to life at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's open to everyone. So plan your visit today and register for free passes at our website, thepeopleshouse.org. And you can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.